Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining me here on Green by Design. For those of you tuning in today, this show, Green by Design, is meant to help professionals in the home industry and design industry to find a voice for a cleaner and greener way forward. And I am your host, Erica Reiner from Eco Method Interiors, and I have with me here today Ben Mead. And Ben is very interesting because he has a background in chemistry and textiles chemistry and has used that to work within different companies that deal with products and textiles. And that's really exciting because, as I always talk about, when you're trying to green a home and a home design, there's the good, better, best system that a lot of us use, where we're trying to find things that are good, things that are a little bit better, and then the things that are best. And for me, best often includes a third-party certification indicating that there's no harmful substances or that something was made responsibly, or so on and so forth, within the green or clean world. And so what's great is that today we're going to have a little bit of an inside look at that certification process and what that means and how it all works. And that is what Ben's expertise is, as he oversees the OEKO-TEX certification whole rigmarole here for the United States for the Hohenstein company, which is one of the third-party companies that are doing certifications under that label. So thank you so much for coming, Ben, and bearing with me through my technical difficulties and spending the time talking to me today.
Yeah, it's great, Erica. Thanks for having us, or thanks for having me and letting us talk and share sort of our story and what we're doing and how we're sort of relating to what customers are wanting and what consumers are looking for, I think, a little bit more in the marketplace today.
Absolutely. Now tell me just a little bit about how you came to be, your journey, like how you came to be doing what you're doing now and what that path was like for you and what you think about what you're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would start in terms of sort of education and really studying. As you alluded to, having a degree in chemistry and textiles is not maybe that common. Growing up in North Carolina, certainly there's a lot more textile industry there. And so I, went to university and studied both of those and really focused then on, okay, what do you do with that? Just like everybody else, no matter what you're doing, you maybe go to school and don't know exactly what that's going to look like. And so I started down the path of working for a textile company, chemical company, as an internship and sort of working in their R&D type lab, and sort of decided, okay, that's not really where I see myself spending the next 30, 40 years of my career. And so, and in that process, kind of learning, okay, that we're making a lot of products, and what does that look like in terms of hazards and health and things like that. So as I went back and decided, okay, what do I want to do next? Then ended up going and working for a brand, a sports brand, and sort of stumbled into an opportunity to work in their development around working with their supply chain and understanding, how do they manage the expectations of suppliers, but also how do you manage more sustainability aspects. So part of that was chemistry, which was a good fit. And so I think that's how I found myself there. But then we end up working through, expectations around water and emissions, and then even sort of how do material innovations factor in with all of those considerations as well.
Right. And did you know much about sustainability or green things before that role and that work life, or was that sort of like an eye-opening experience for you? Like how interested were you in it? How much did you get to learn, or how much did you get to bring to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I brought a little bit of an expectation. I mean, it's always kind of, you go to your first job and you never know exactly what to expect anyway, and that shapes, I think, a lot of how you work in general. But having some classes in school and talking about chemicals that are used in industry and what do they maybe mean on the finished products, but also what do they mean in terms of a manufacturing standpoint. So I would say I was familiar with it, but at the same time, I think it was a time when that was really growing from a consumer brand perspective as well. So I think within the organization, there wasn't a ton of experience. We were all sort of learning as we went as well. And so I think just working for a company that was really focused on learning that and putting resources behind it was a great opportunity for myself, but also you can certainly see that still going forward. I think at that time there were maybe 6 or 7 people within the whole company that were working on sustainability related initiatives, and now they probably have a couple hundred people that have it directly in their title,
Wow.
aside from people that are doing it on their own. So I think that is certainly a lot more prevalent today than it was back then.
Yeah. Wow. So now, are you still in North Carolina?
No, actually, I live in Indiana. So like you mentioned, we're the representatives of OEKO-TEX here in the US. And my team is sort of scattered because we're working both with manufacturers of products, but also with brands that are trying to implement it into their own chemical management strategies or their sustainability strategies. So like everybody's doing right now, we're remote, but we were remote even before then. So most of our team is working from home offices and out there supporting companies where they are.
Interesting. Okay, pronounce the shorthand of the certification for me.
Sure. So OEKO-TEX. So it's a German Austrian foundation. So it's that's where the pronunciation comes from, and it really means eco. So OEKO in German means eco, and so that's still carries through. I think I've heard anecdotally the story that if they imagined 27 years ago, 28 years ago, when it was founded, that this was going to be an international standard and something that was internationally recognizable, maybe there would be a little bit different naming, but we got too far down that path, and now there's too much branding behind it that you're not going to be changing the name now. So
yeah, okay.
Here we are. That's our number one question in the U.S. How do we pronounce?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm so glad I finally learned it. I say it all different kinds of ways in my mind when I read it, and normally I just spell it out like that on this podcast. But now I know OEKO-TEX. Okay, cool. So the point of it, maybe you could give us a little bit of background on what it is and why it's beneficial, and maybe especially if you can, or if not, I'll pop in how that might be applicable to the interior design world, or if you've ever worked with any design, like specifically design trade companies.
Sure. So the organization of OEKO-TEX has been around, like I mentioned, since 1992, nearly 30 years now. And it really has its foundation around chemical safety and making sure that it's a clear communicated message to a consumer that the product has been tested and is free from harmful levels of those substances. So chemicals that are used or have been traditionally used in textiles is where the standard started. So the name Standard 100, which is one of the standards under the umbrella of OEKO-TEX, gets its name from the fact that there were initially 100 substances that were restricted. So now, 30 years later, there's about 350 plus substances that are on that list. So we certainly see the knowledge about what could be used or could be hazardous growing, and that influences how does the standard evolve. And so, new substances are added, restrictions get tighter, legislation changes, all of those things can influence how the standard changes. And likewise, OEKO-TEX has changed as well. So that's still the core standard. It's what OEKO-TEX is most known for, but there are other standards for chemical suppliers or for more sustainability practices in manufacturing. And ultimately all of that, kind of boils down to what does it look like from a consumer, and how are they able to recognize, there's a standard on that product that gives me some sort of assurance, and how easy is it for me to understand what's the meaning behind it? Because even within OEKO-TEX, there are a couple of different consumer facing standards or labels. And so even knowing those differences there can be significant.
Right. So it's great to hear that all these new substances have been added to the list. Does OEKO-TEX headquarters sort of assess like what, okay, basically we know that since World War II, so many new chemicals have been invented, thousands and thousands and tens of thousands. So how do you know how they might decide or learn about a new one that's become out onto the market and be like, okay, we're going to put that on our list and we're going to include that in our certification process?
Yeah, so part of it comes from legislation. So legislation is a big piece of it. So OEKO-TEX is a global organization. So like we're sitting here in the US, we have counterparts in all other production and retail countries. And so as part of that annual review process, that expertise from the different regions and the different institutes, so the different labs that are coming together and supporting OEKO-TEX are bringing that information and saying, okay, these are new substances that we see, coming in as a concern from, research or from, other scientific, maybe even NGO communities, and saying, okay, we're starting to talk about some of these. We know that they're being manufactured. And OEKO-TEX then deciding, okay, is it relevant to textiles? And second, is it relevant in terms of hazard, something that we should be concerned about? And then part of it comes just from the experience of testing. Most of the implementation, so the actual certification, is done by testing laboratories. So we're testing for OEKO-TEX, but we're also testing in other cases. And so we collect a lot of data and we start to see a little bit more what are substances that are popping up as we're testing products, and what do we need to know a little bit more about those.
Right. That's great. So pretty much from all of the world, which is great because I would assume that different parts of the world, different people in different countries are developing different things. So it's, and historically in the US, we have outlawed a lot fewer than Europe. So that I think is really important to mention. What are have you ever seen like a couple substances that have been added to the list that you were like, oh my God, like that's so crazy. Like, of course we should be avoiding these in our textiles. Like, have there ever been like some super concerning ones that you're like, what the heck?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it doesn't normally work that way, that we're so familiar with these chemicals and then all of a sudden they get added. Certainly you get substances that you might have heard about in other places that then come across to like textiles or to some consumer products. So I would say, it's kind of similar in the sense of, like, we hear about BPA in food and in food liners and things like that. There also could be products that are consumer products that are within our scope that could be made with polycarbonate resins where that could be relevant. So I think it's more the case of like, oh, I didn't think that chemical was used to make that product, rather than that's a chemical that we should restrict. When we see a lot around, what I think is relevant, even more for your listeners too, around flame retardants, around water repellents, and oil repellents and things like that can be, especially in the case that a textile is supposed to be more durable and prevent other safety hazards. How do we manage that risk along both of those? And so I think those are areas where we continue to see more growth in restrictions, both around flame retardants and around sort of oil and water repellent technologies.
Right. And you might be referring to the restrictions in terms of acceptable levels?
Yeah, both acceptable levels, or really within industries, kind of what's a necessary use.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
So, certainly within OEKO-TEX and within the standard 100, there's a whole list of chemicals, but then there's also different use scenarios that are important as we factor in. So if we know a product is going to be used for baby apparel, we might consider the testing requirements and the limit values a little different than, a decorative item that we don't think anybody's going to touch, and they're certainly not going to put in their mouth, right? Because the exposure of how they get those chemicals is going to be a little different.
Right. Absolutely. So you're considering a lot of human behavior factors, you're considering use factors, you're considering quantity or level, like parts per million or trillion or whatever. You're considering a few different things to keep people safe. Now, I have to confess, when you mentioned North Carolina, I was going to ask a controversial or maybe like a touchy question. I don't know. I was going to ask if you've received any pushback or, like just pushback based on the fact that historically redder states have been a little bit more adverse to environmental or governmental, which can include environmental controls or limits or things like that. So I'd be curious to know now about any instances like that, if you know how you've come across or the company's come across, because what I would like to see is sustainability, and in particularly the way into sustainability as a whole through the lens of human health and safety, be a non-partisan issue. But I'd love to get any thoughts on that you might have. I know it's a little bit of a tougher question.
Well, I mean, it is. I certainly can take a little bit of an easy way out of it, because we're, OEKO-TEX and the standards are really private standards. They're voluntary standards. So it's not something that is, mandated from a legislative standpoint. And so in the same way that you talked a few minutes ago, generally the US doesn't have as stricter requirements as a lot of places around the world. And so I think that that fact alone has made it a little bit slower for adoption of a standard like Standard 100 from OEKO-TEX here in the US, just because it's really driven by a different mechanism pulls it, right? So it's really pulled by either a brand's commitment or a consumer demand for it. And so we see that a little bit more. I think a lot of times if I'm going to talk about resistance that I get, or people calling me up and saying, hey, I'm mad that I have to do this, it's not because they've been told by legislation that they have to do it. It's most likely because a consumer asked them to do it, or their customer asked them to do it. So, joking aside, it's like the response is then, well, if you don't want it, if you don't want to do it, that's your choice. But, this is what we're seeing, and we're seeing more and more consumers asking for it, partly because they're seeing it at certain retailers and certain, they're seeing more and more opportunity to find it. And so that's driving more and more expectation that it should be available, or there should be choices, or at least they should have an easy way to know that it's there, or know about, is the product I'm buying safe outside of US legislative requirements?
Yes, and you just tapped into my favorite topic, which is, market-driven cross section between economics and environmental issues, because as you said, in this country, we're super, capitalist market driven. And so in order for OEKO-TEX to become more widely applied or on lots of different things, it has to be driven by market demands and purchasing, which is a lot of what this podcast is about, is to help designers help their clients and help the industry as a whole be able to put our money where our mouth is and make those, economic gains, those market share gains, where it's more widely available. Maybe the price of things that are certified goes down because it evens the playing field in terms of spending, the cost to get something certified. So that's really, really important to me. And I think to everyone who wants to understand how to make an industry or a state or an organization greener is, in this country, while I think legislation is huge, I think both are hugely important, top down legislation, et cetera. I also think we'll see really big changes if we can educate a lot of people about the options that are out there, and good, better, best ways of purchasing things. And B, once they're educated about that, actually choosing those products and materials. And then hopefully over time, we see cost of those things come down, just like I always reference, like the agricultural movement when, organic food and non-GMO and locally grown became more popular and more affordable. I always, apologies to anyone who's heard me say this before, but I always use like the example of the time that I found in Trader Joe's that organic spaghetti was like the $1 cheaper than the regular. And I was like, we've done it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's true in a sense too, from the economics of being able to put a label on your product and say that, okay, it's free from harmful substances, or it's been tested for these harmful substances, mean that you've invested money in testing it to know that that's true, to a certain extent. I mean, there certainly are other pieces that are important, which is knowing the supply chain and knowing what went into the recipes to make it in the first place. And then the testing itself can be more or less a confirmation. But it's no secret that a lot of the products that are made by producers that are making similar products for other companies as well. So if I buy a product from one brand in the marketplace, it might have come from the same factory, from the same suppliers as another one. And so even though it might look totally different, what's important to OEKO-TEX is what's the inputs that went into it. And so there is a piece of strategy there that everybody wins by if they're supporting a certification and saying, okay, I'm buying raw materials coming from this source, and that source has already certified their products, then there can be some economy of scale in terms of the next person that comes along not having to ask them to spend another $1,000 testing for the same chemicals to get the same answer they expected. And so I think that's what we've seen change a little bit more in the last 15 or 20 years, is that companies started to develop their lists, and they developed them kind of in silos. But as they started to understand and see what are other companies doing with these lists, they learned that they're pretty similar, right? And so being able, in a way, to if I'm a brand and I say, okay, I have a list of chemicals I don't want, we can agree on that. But do I need to go out there and ask for my own test if I know that company I'm buying from already has a certification? Probably not, right? So you might do some spot checking, but you're not asking them to add on another cost, and certainly that benefits you and it benefits your customer as well.
That's a really great point I hadn't thought of before, of how that economy of scale would work. And in general, have you seen more and more companies sign on to get the certification? Like what kind of popularity gains have you seen over time? Like one of my I have to cut out some dog barking, sorry. What have you seen in terms of positive shifts in your side of the industry?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a lot of increase
Sorry.
Okay.
Give me 1 second before you answer that. I think we're going to address the dog situation. Okay, there we go.
All right. Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen an increase in demand for the certifications in the market. And I think that part of that is driven by, every company that's selling a product has a competitor. And as they see products being sold that are labeled, then that sort of starts to ask, how can we get that? And so we see a lot of people that are starting down the process of getting standard 100 certification to really start at those places where they have suppliers that already have a certificate and get that included into their labeling or into their portfolio.
Thank you for that. Okay, so one of the last things I have on my list to ask you is, what do you want us to know that we haven't covered yet? Maybe on behalf of your company or the topic as a whole.
I think in terms of what do we want to know, a lot of it's driven by the fact that, okay, that this demand, like we talked about outside of legislation, is really driven from a consumer perspective. So the expectation that a certification is valuable and that it's available is, the brands, retailers, producers, they need to hear that, or they're going to prioritize other things. And so I think that is sort of number one for us, is that, okay, consumers needing to understand what does the certification mean and what value does it have for them. And then second, sort of, how do you prioritize what does sustainability mean for you, in terms of, is it chemicals going into it? Is it chemicals and social where it was made? Is it environmental from a manufacturing standpoint, or is it all of those? Because there are certifications that exist in the market related to all of those holistically. You don't have to just settle for one piece of it.
Well, very well said. Thank you so much for your time today. I so appreciate all of your really interesting insider insights. Let us know where one place that our listeners can find you, or the company or anyone you want to be as the representative.
Yeah, I mean, so the easiest way to find companies that are selling OEKO-TEX certified products is to go to the OEKO-TEX website and look at a buying guide. So there's a free tool that's there that companies, either B2B companies are buying products, or consumers can find. And so again, that's just at OEKOTEX.com.
That's perfect. And so as designers, we'll be able to go on there and look for sheets or throw blankets or something like that we might need. Sure. That's a perfect tool. Thank you so much again for explaining all of these really interesting things to us and giving a little peek behind the curtain. I always talk about this certification, and I so appreciated it. So we will see you next time, and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Erica.